We would like to welcome you once again for joining us here today for this very special luncheon featuring the Africa Finance Corporation. Hopefully you are all enjoying your lunch and you're ready for the important message that our presenters have prepared for you today. Following the presentation, we'll allow some time for some questions and answers. And so without further ado, let me begin our program by introducing our first speaker. He studied economics at the University of Nigeria, where he won the prize of the Faculty of the Social Sciences for the best graduating master's degree student, and subsequently, yeah. He's ready.
Well, once he said the University of Nigeria, I then knew what he was about to talk about. And then let me just say how delighted I am and join my voice in welcoming all of you to this particular event. For me personally, one is really speechless, because this particular event happens to be the very first public outing that the Africa Finance Corporation is having since the formal governance structures are put in place in terms of the board, the management, and some of the key staff took off. And therefore, it gives me, sometime early this year, January, February, sometime even early March, we moved around. We were in New York, we were in London, we were in some African capitals promoting the idea of the Africa Finance Corporation. And I think this luncheon, is simply to say it's alive at last. And I want to say, let me start by welcoming all of you, the honorable ministers here. You can see Ibn Chambers, the executive secretary of the ECOWAS, the former. Oh, sorry. Your Excellency, Mr. President, sir. You're welcome. I see many CEOs of regional institutions, the former executive director at the World Bank, the honorable ministers. I see honorable Minister of Finance, the Minister of National Planning, the distinguished senators. I must especially acknowledge that you have the chair of the Senate Committee on Banking and the chair of the House of Reps Committee on Banking, all seated here. Baroness Choka, it's really a pleasure to have you. Now, all the CEOs of various institutions, African and global, the movers and shakers of the world financial and business community. I want to say a big welcome to all of you, and to say that the Africa Finance Corporation, what I'm supposed to do, and I'm asked to just say so in very few minutes and leave the floor for the real thing to come. Mine is to simply welcome you and to say that the idea of the Africa Finance Corporation being a private sector-led African investment bank actually was motivated by the huge need in Africa, the huge developmental challenges in Africa, especially in the areas of infrastructure, and I will come to that in a second, especially in the areas of infrastructure, mining, financial services, telecommunication, industrialization generally. The need is huge. The financing needs happen also to be huge, but the available resources are very small. And as well as the fact that indeed bankable projects are also very few and far between. I participated before I joined government in a major project that led to the book entitled Can Africa Claim the 21st Century? And we said the answer to that happened to be yes, provided. And the major model in all of those, and several of the other thoughts that have come, is that if Africa is to claim the 21st century, it must be a development process that is led by the private sector. Currently, much of the landscape in terms of regional financing in Africa is dominated by multilateral institutions. They are doing very important work. The World Bank, the ADB, the IFC, and several others, Afrexim, and so on and so forth, and even sub-regional financial institutions. But relative to need, the need is simply humongous, and the available resources few. And therefore, we reason that the time has come, if we truly want a private sector-led development in Africa to take root, that development process, as a necessary accompaniment or complement to the set of financial institutions, must also be a private sector-led investment bank that will help the process of not only project origination, but also in helping to put together the requisite financing, especially for private sector-led projects. I think the numbers speak for themselves. Rather, that's why I just left it there. There are some slides there in terms of trying to estimate the huge need in Africa, all over, especially infrastructure. But AFC, being a private sector-led initiative, has come to complement, not to substitute for, the existing ones. Because our thesis is that even if you have 10 more AFCs, 10 more IFCs, 10 more ADBs, and 10 more of the exposure of the World Bank in Africa, there will still not be enough relative to the huge needs of the continent. And therefore, AFC comes on stream to complement the existing set of institutions in the continent today. It started as a dream, a simple idea, but today it has taken form. It's taking form, and it is, I believe, that in the next few years, in the next couple of years, the Africa Finance Corporation will truly be the key driver of infrastructure financing, development financing, the area of industries, and the coterie of sectors which I think the CEO will elaborate upon in a few minutes. But a key idea is that it has come to complement the set of institutions and not to well, I don't want to say not to compete. Some areas there might be a little bit of competition, and I think we need a bit of it, isn't it? And I tell you just two little stories. I think in one of the sessions at the World Bank, somebody said that for one of the development institutions here, it takes an average of about 3 years to negotiate a project and 2 years to start disbursement. And they say it's concessional. Well, when you add the opportunity cost of all of those, of waiting for 5 years to start, drawing down on it, and even when that, with all the conditions I tried to it in a haphazard manner, the true cost of it might be even much more than you could, walk just across the road and talk to AFC and get it financed. So, so you're likely going to get a little bit of pressure coming from there. And then there is a little story which we were told this. It sounded like a joke about one of the institutions that holds sway in Africa participating in financing a particular project, and then AFC comes also to be part of the same project, and that institution now calls the promoters and says, listen, we don't want that other one to put in more money than, we don't want AFC to put in more money than we are putting. So whatever they put in, we are likely going to scale up our own too. Well, if AFC in this form is engendering new competition, and there is also a regional institution in Africa, which I understand has tried to scale up its involvement and engagement in the area of infrastructure financing. They're trying to reform their processes to ensure quicker discussions and disbursement, because I was told by one of them that in their board meetings now, hardly do they finish without somebody in one way or the other referencing the fact that, well, if you people are here, then the AFC might take up the field. And I say, if it is competition in this sense, then welcome to the world of the AFC. And I think Africa will be much better for it. The dream is for us to have additionality. For Africa, if Africa stands a chance of claiming the 21st century, you are welcome to join the train of the AFC. At least there are options, there are alternatives, and this key strength in the area of asset origination. I want to acknowledge particularly the members of the board of directors of the AFC who are here, the CEO who was speaking, and especially the Honorable Minister of Finance, Dr. Shamsuddin Usman, who happened to be, well, still today he's still a member of the board, even though he's migrated to the other side as the Honorable Minister of Finance. That has to still, if he would, well, Honorable Minister, we'll have to talk about that. Whether you wear, how you wear the two caps. And so, Honorable Minister Dr. Usman is here, the Honorable Minister of Finance. We have Dr. Mrs. Ibru, who is the CEO of Oceanic Bank, I think one of the largest banks now in Africa, is here. And then, that's the CEO of, I don't want to say First Bank, First Bank, which is, I want to advertise that the Leadway Assurance. Yeah. Well, you're welcome, sir. It is Pan-African. So far, we've raised about $1.05 billion in capital. It has an authorized share capital of $2 billion. Well, if you still want to write the check, for the bit of it, we can negotiate and see in what terms you can come in. But the train has left the station. I want to say welcome, and may we then relax and listen to the real presentations. I think at this juncture, I just want to squeeze on. These are the things I was asked to say, but I have left them, and you can get a copy later on. Okay? Thank you very much. I welcome Ometorowa, the CEO of Sonama Capabilities.
What I would like to do is to basically give some definition of the thought process that has led us to this stage and our vision for the future, including the directions that we envisage to take the AFC. I think that one point is clear. Africa today is the least developed continent in the world by, all of the matrices that we're looking at. That represents a significant challenge because 50 years after independence of the continent, we're still struggling with significant issues of development. Now, one of the things that is very crucial for us is that the AFC should not become another institution, because already in the spheres of development, there are 3 cycles of institutions: the international development finance institutions, the international private banks, and the local financial institutions. If 50 years after, we're still talking about the challenges of development, we have to think through as to what is it that AFC will bring to the table that would result in significant improvement and significant result. Because it's not sufficient to just have another institution that is designed to do exactly what everybody else is doing. And that's why we spent 8 weeks in a very intensive strategic exercise with McKinsey & Company, because we wanted to have that clarity that AFC can add value and deliver value, so that 50 years after, and hopefully, probably 5 to 10 years after, the results of AFC can become much more practical, for the environment. Why is there no development 50 years after? We think that there are probably 2 or 3 very critical issues that represent, the pillars of this problem. We know there's development problems in Africa, but the challenge is, how do you convert these problems into bankable projects? Because it's not sufficient that all of these problems of infrastructure, of industrial capacity exist. Except these problems are converted to bankable projects, it's going to be very difficult to engage the private sector in assisting in the resolution. Now, if you want the private sector to be involved, the private sector has to go through the process of understanding that the project works, the project can achieve returns, the risk that exists in the project can be diffused, and there are structures that will make the investors comfortable. We are very clear in our mind that there's sufficient capital in the world that are looking for bankable projects, especially in a situation where, with Africa, it's very rare that you have in most of the sectors monopoly positions in the sectors we're talking about. In the rest of the world, you actually have situations of excess capacity. But in Africa, you actually have no capacity. So in most cases, when you're looking at projects, you're setting up the first project in an environment where already people pay international prices for very little capacity. So one of the focus that AFC will have is to basically originate and create bankable projects. The second focus is the issue of risk capital. It's much more difficult to actually have a bankable project and attract investors and lenders if the project sponsors don't have the capital required to ensure that the project is complete, both fiscally and financially, and to sustain the project. Now, it's obvious as well that most of the projects with the African sponsors, most African sponsors have limited capital, and that in itself tends to undermine the bankability of the project, because most of the lenders and the investors are not comfortable that the sponsors, in the event of cost overrun, in the event of delay, can come up with the resources, the equity resources, to make the project work and to complete the project. Now, finally, it's also obvious that the opportunities that exist in Africa are largely misunderstood. There's a lot of research about African private sector and African business, but most of the research flows from the macro research, the research of existing companies, but there's very little research about project development, about new projects, about new sectors. And this is an area that we want to focus on. Now, finally, We want to be in partnership with existing institutions because it doesn't make sense that if we want to fire on all cylinders, there's already institutions that have been established for many years and have skill sets and resources. I think that our role should be really to push the envelope so that all of the institutions that currently exist and are targeted at developing Africa can work with AFC and can actually use the AFC model to make that incremental effort. And I think at the minimum, we'll consider this initiative a success if all of the three circles of institutions are galvanized and motivated by the AFC and by what AFC does to do much more, for the development of Africa. I talked about bankable projects. One of the things that we did was to basically focus on what are the key sectors that we have to prioritize. The challenge is that if you don't focus and prioritize, we could end up losing the concentration of where we can have the most critical development impact and the most critical return for the investors. We have selected 6 sectors: power, oil and gas, transportation, heavy industry, mining, and telecoms. These 6 sectors represent, in a sense, very critical examples of the shortages of capacity that exist today. For power, for example, a country like Nigeria with 140 million population has about 3,000 megawatts of power. That's the equivalent of 30 watts per person, which is half a light bulb. That demonstrates how critical, the shortage that currently exists in the power sector. And that is the same picture, thank you, in West Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. The oil and gas sector is a critical sector as well. To sustain 2.5 million barrels per day production in Nigeria requires an investment of about $15 billion. Now, under current situation, the government is actually having to take from the treasury probably $3 to $4 billion of cash call to co-invest with Shell and Chevron to sustain the production. Now, if you think about it, that's $3 to $4 billion of resources that should go to health and education that is actually going to the most bankable sector in the economy, because there's no reason why the oil sector should not be bankable, especially when you're talking about sustaining working investments. Transportation is also quite a critical challenge. We're all familiar about air safety in Africa. Most African airlines don't acquire new aircrafts. Most of them, the average age of the African airline aircrafts are probably 15 to 20 years old. That has serious implications for air safety. Similarly with the airports in terms of navigational aids, that also has serious implications in terms of safety. Sub-Saharan Africa has no deep sea ports. Over the last 5 to 6 years, international freights have increased by about 1,000%. Now, the reality of what has happened is that if you don't have a deep sea port and each of the countries are basically, there's no transshipment, it makes it much more expensive for businesses to develop and to thrive. Now, the same thing with shipping. There's very little shipping capacity that represents African content. And the whole viability of shipping business is captive cargo. Now, if you think about it, there's significant captive cargo that African businesses and countries generate, but they've not been able to develop a shipping capacity, to match that. Heavy industry that cuts across cement, steel, petrochemical, fertilizer, aluminum. These are all industries that, given the natural resources that Africa has, in terms of natural gas, in terms of power, Africa should not be importing cement, for example. I mean, most of Africa imports cement. And what is cement? Cement is limestone and gas. Nigeria is one of the largest importers of cement in the world, with probably one of the highest cement prices in the world. Now, I think that one of the exciting examples of cement is it took a local Nigerian business to be able to create a capacity that has ensured that Nigeria's capacity, rather than being 3 million tons for the last 30 years, is now actually increasing to about 11 million tons. But the reality was that, quite frankly, as far as the existing providers of the 3 million ton capacity were concerned, they made more money from importing cement than manufacturing cement locally. So we actually have what really is a ridiculous situation where you have Cameroon, Nigeria, West Africa, Congo importing cement from Taiwan that effectively gets the energy from Africa, and the shipment is $100 per ton to import cement. So that demonstrates again where capacity is quite critical. Mining is even more challenging. I mean, over the last 6-7 years, there's been a global boom in mining. But there's probably only one mining company that is owned by an African, Moana, Kalapinga. Now, imagine all of that wealth that has been created from the massive increase in prices from copper to gold, and there's not one, significant African capacity in mining. Finally, telecoms. There's clearly progress with telecoms, with the GSM businesses. But there's no progress in the backbone. There's a significant effort, for example, to create a $100 computer, for the continent and developing countries. But the challenge is that it still costs $150 per month to access internet. So quite frankly, except you invest in the backbone, there's very little value addition you can achieve. Now, I give most of these examples because in the presentations that are going to come through, what we've done as AFC is that we're not going to sit and wait for applications to come to us looking for financing. We have to be proactive. We have to basically look at these critical sectors and look at them because they are bankable in the context of you have a capacity that doesn't exist today. You have a market that people are paying international prices for. Of course, there are risks, but the risks as bankers, we are trained, the training of bankers is to understand risk, to mitigate risk, to structure risk. And that's where you make profits, you make gains, because you are able to manage risk. And I think that's the skill set that we want to bring to bear in development lending. I will give a summary of what our business model is. As I said, our mission is not to basically sit and wait for application. Our mission is to be proactive. Now, what that entails is that we basically want to seed capital projects, and we want to take responsibility for project financing it. Now, that clearly means that once we are drivers of these projects, we are able to get partners to work with us. We're not going to take stupid risks. We want to have a disciplined approach, and that's why we're starting with prioritization. We're focusing on sectors, industries that are bankable. It's so important because as a private sector initiative, this is what makes the difference, because we're very comfortable that private sector have the capacity to build projects, to complete projects, to sustain projects. And that's why it complements whatever efforts the public sector has been undertaking to date. And it provides, the vision that we want to put on, want to push forward as a solution to develop Africa. I will not go into the details for the interest of time, but I would like to summarize this way. We already have raised $1 billion of capital. Now, based on the Tier 1 capital ratio of 10%, that gives us a capacity